As the sun set on the Tokugawa shogunate, the people of Japan danced the night away. A month after the last shogun Yoshinobu resigned his office, a group of British diplomats were greeted by a weird and wonderful sight upon arrival in Osaka. We found the city in an uproar of joy and excitement. It appeared that all this was in honor of a miraculous shower which had recently taken place of slips of paper bearing the titles of the gods of Ise. Thousands and thousands of happy fanatics were dancing along the streets just in holiday garb, shouting till they must have been hoarse, "Ii janai ka, ii janai ka." This phrase "ii janai ka," or more commonly "e janai ka," which depending on the context can be translated as "isn't it great?", "who cares?" or "why the hell not?", gives us the name for an episode of dancing fever which broke out in the fall of 1867 and raged on until early summer the following year, during which time it had affected an area stretching from Edo in the east to Hiroshima in the west, and Japan had entered a new age. Given the momentous context in which it took place, "e janai ka" is often attributed to a vague sense of uncertainty surrounding political change and becomes little more than an amusing footnote in histories of the Meiji Restoration. In this video, we're going to look at the dancing fever of 1867 as a complex topic in its own right, and seek to understand the logic behind this series of communal religious celebrations. The outbreak can be traced back to a sleepy village called Muro near the post station of Yoshida on the Tokaido Highway. Religious life here revolved around the Muro Hachimangu shrine, whose head priest left a record of the strange events which would trigger a national phenomenon. On the 14th day of the 7th month, 1867, an amulet of the outer Ise shrine was found near the bamboo fence surrounding a villager's house. A man named Tomikichi picked it up and showed it to a neighborhood leader. They both had doubts about its authenticity, not because they didn't believe that divine amulets could fall from the sky, but because it looked different from the ones which had fallen some 30 years ago. Their discussion inconclusive, Tomikichi went home. That night, his 8-year-old son suddenly passed away. Meanwhile, as talk of the amulet spread, another villager pronounced himself a skeptic. His wife died the next day. There was now no question. The amulet had fallen from the heavens, and 2 non-believers had met with divine punishment. A second amulet had also been found in a tree, this one from Izawa Shrine, a branch of the Ise shrines which had caused something of a fad in the Tokai region a century earlier. Villages across the provinces of Owari, Mikawa, and Totomi sent representatives to Izawa Shrine to receive a wooden hoe, which was thought to bring bountiful harvests when enshrined with a celebration called the Ho Festival. Muro village also took part in the 1767 festivities and was just planning a centennial celebration of the Ho Festival when the amulet from Izawa Shrine appeared. It was a sign. The head priest convened a meeting of village leaders, and they decided to hold a 3-day festival to honor the Izawa amulet. It would double as the much-anticipated Ho Festival, while also following the format of a celebration held in 1830, when amulets of the Ise shrines had fallen from the sky. This was actually part of a national mass pilgrimage event known as Okage Mairi, or Thanks Pilgrimage, which we'll discuss later. For now, the important point is that "e janai ka" did not begin as something entirely new. It grew out of existing religious celebrations, but pretty soon it outgrew them. By the time the 3-day festival was over, more amulets had fallen. When it rained, it poured, and clouds were gathering over the nearby post station of Yoshida. Once festival fever hit the Tokaido Highway, it spread like wildfire. The first major city to be hit was Nagoya. Amulets started falling at the end of the 8th month, and by the middle of the 9th, over 1,200 had fallen on the city. Over half were from the Ise shrines and a popular regional god called Akiba. while a diverse mix of deities comprised the rest. They hailed from locations as far as Tsurugaoka Hachimangu in the east to Itsukushima Shrine in the west, and represented multiple pantheons. Found alongside amulets of Shinto gods were images and actual wooden and bronze statues of Buddhist deities. The discovery of an amulet would first be reported to the authorities, who would then order that it be enshrined for 7 days, with the caveat that extravagant festivities were prohibited. People conveniently forgot this last point. One of our best accounts of the festivities in Nagoya is the diary of Hosono Yosai, a Confucian scholar of samurai status who served Owari domain. He gives us a general description of how an amulet would be enshrined. First, a makeshift space was created in front of the building where it was found using folding screens or drapes, wherein an altar was constructed. Offerings of sake, steamed rice, snacks, vegetables, fruits, and fish were placed in front. Lanterns inscribed with the name of the deity were hung up, and twin stalks of bamboo erected, tied together by a rope which cordoned off the altar as sacred space. The number of makeshift shrines lining the streets was so great that all the bamboo seemed to form a thicket, and at night the lanterns shined like stars. Townspeople gathered to pay their respects to the amulets, but they rarely stopped there. Soon the altars shared the streets with elaborate festival decorations and processions of revelers dancing and making a racket with drums and flutes. Participation was mandatory. When one household failed to quickly enshrine an amulet, this time it was not amulets which rained on their house, but stones, which smashed through their roof and caused injuries below. Perhaps they were lucky it was only stones. In Shinano province to the northeast, uncooperative households were pranked with horse bones, or even human arms and heads. Our scholarly observer, for his part, thought that people had gone mad. But, he noted, compared to the hunger and hardship of last year, this fall's harvest is plentiful, and people's hearts are at ease. So perhaps they could be forgiven. For a while, the authorities seemed to agree. After all, being a party pooper could have consequences. When one neighborhood leader named Shichizaemon ordered that a recently discovered amulet of Akiba was not to be enshrined, a teenage boy thrust his hands into a brazier, pulled out a piece of burning firewood, and rushed at him, shouting, "How dare you doubt the gods?" Shichizaemon cowered in fear and apologized. Then, to dispel any remaining doubts, the boy worked a miracle by entering the flame and writing the name of the Akiba deity on a piece of paper, even though he had not been holding paper, ink, or brush, and he was illiterate. The madness continued on and off for a whole 2 months before the authorities finally decided to issue an outright ban. Skeptics like Shichizaemon were no doubt relieved. Others may have grumbled about the end of a boost in sales. Yosai notes that those who profited most from the festivities were merchants who dealt in candles, sake, lanterns, clothing, and fish. But for most people, it was back to work after a rare opportunity to let loose. We could go on forever thanks to the tremendous amount of work done to unearth local histories of the dancing fever. But in the interest of time, let's look at one more case study before zooming out to consider the significance of these events. And what better location than Ise, whose twin deities were manifesting all over the country. Amulets began falling on the Holy Land in the 10th month. Even in their home base, the Ise deities did not have a monopoly. A variety of gods descended upon the dancing townspeople, including the 11-faced Kannon of Sensoji in faraway Edo. An eyewitness account comes to us from a man who, at the time, worked as a servant in a merchant's shop. When a place of business such as his was blessed with an amulet, the owner would close for about 5 days and focus on offering passers-by a drink of sake. Meanwhile, servants were free to join the throngs of people parading the streets, dancing to chants of "Ei janaika," the earliest recorded instance of the phrase. Men dressed as women, women dressed as men, and the elderly dressed as youngsters. Costumed crowds barged into shops and trampled all over tatami mats without taking their shoes off, excusing themselves with cries of "Why the hell not?" They thronged to the Ise shrines, tossing coins by the wayside as they went. A beggar could do quite well for himself. Strangers embraced on the road, exclaiming, "Let's get drunk, why the hell not?" One woman, rumored to be a princess of nearby Toba Castle, made the pilgrimage completely naked, except for hair accessories worth a small fortune and a piece of paper covering her nether regions. Regarding this last point, as people danced, they sang a song that went like, "Stick a piece of paper on your you-know-what. If it falls off, stick it on again. Who cares? Anything goes. Thanks to the gods, times are good." It was hardly the silliest song to come out of this ordeal. In Osaka, people sing, "If you're an octopus, I'm an octopus, and if we're both octopuses, who cares if we drown?" Like in Nagoya, the authorities were mostly willing to turn a blind eye for a time. After all, it was rumored that when authorities in nearby Toba ordered a stop to the festivities, a tengu had manifested signs of divine displeasure. However, their patience had a limit. As townsmen conjured up ever more elaborate costumes for their shrine visits, donning armor and wielding spears in the manner of samurai, even dressing up as Lord Yoritomo himself, the authorities said enough is enough. By the middle of the 12th month, the streets began to quiet down. Our observer ends his account by noting that, all in all, 1867 was a strange year. Now let's take a step back and try to make sense out of what may seem like nonsense. So, was there any method to the madness? Well, as we've seen, typically amulets were reported to the local authorities, who would grant permission to enshrine them for a fixed period of 3 or 7 days. And furthermore, these celebrations could be modeled on precedent. So yes, there was some degree of order. There was also a pattern to how the amulets fell, because they seemed to favor wealthy people. If an amulet fell on your house, it was your responsibility to not only enshrine it, but also to provide food and drink for people who came to worship it. And all that could get costly. One wealthy merchant family in a village to the south of Nagoya held a 2-week-long non-stop party because at the end of the initial 7-day celebration, a second amulet hit the house. Their expenses totaled over 155 ryo of gold, which equated to roughly 80 koku of rice at 1863 values, before rice prices blew up. This was more than the annual salary of many samurai. In other words, one function of the celebrations was to redistribute wealth among a community by forcing its richer members to pay for festivities open to everybody. People knew what they were doing when they made amulets miraculously appear on their wealthy neighbors' houses. One merchant in Tokushima was blessed with 541 amulets in a single day. And as we've seen, refusal was not an option, unless you wanted stones, or body parts, raining down on your roof. Well-to-do homes can also fall victim to a dance-in, like a break-in but by a dancing mob. Oral histories gathered in early 20th century Tokushima provide colorful testimony of this practice. One elder recalled, "We went to the houses of chaps we used to hate or to the homes of people who pretended they were big shots and danced right in, shouting, 'Ain't it great, ain't it great?' We destroyed the floor mats and doors, taking any good-looking furniture." Another reminisced, "When we came to the house where amulets had fallen, we'd dance at the doorway and shout, 'Ain't it great, ain't it great?' And then we'd force our way in, with muddy feet, straw sandals or whatever, and dance around the house. Then the people in the house would panic and give us something to eat and drink." At their rowdiest, the celebrations provided an opportunity for less affluent community members to gang up and take out their frustrations on the rich. Another question we might ask is, how unique was Eijanaika? If similar events had happened before when the shogunate wasn't falling apart, then we can't say that the dancing fever was simply an expression of the turbulent times. First, we may note that divine objects falling from the sky wasn't unheard of in the Tokugawa period. Just as a random example, a merchant in the castle town of Kawagoe named Enomoto Yazaemon recorded in his journal that one autumn day in 1653, threads of lotus flower rained from the sky. Given the significance of the lotus in Buddhism, and the fact that this happened the day before a big festival, people took it as an auspicious sign from the gods. Note the similarities with what happened in Muro village, where the 1867 celebrations began. The first amulets fell just as the village was getting ready for the centennial celebration of the Ho festival. In both cases, we can infer that some sneaky fellow planted divine objects in anticipation of an upcoming festival, presumably to get people excited. In Kawagoe, interestingly enough, it was actually the domain authorities who discovered the miracle and sent out notice to the townspeople. You'll also recall that the initial celebrations in Muro village were modeled on a previous incident when amulets had fallen from the sky. This was the 1830 Thanks Pilgrimage, or Okage Mairi, Okage meaning divine blessing or thanks to someone or something, and Mairi meaning pilgrimage. This was a phenomenon of mass pilgrimage to the Ise shrines, which had occurred several times throughout the Tokugawa period, but the 1830 event was the biggest, with as many as 5 million people from across western and central Japan making the trip to Ise in the span of about half a year. For comparison, the entire population of Japan at this time is estimated to have been 27 million. Like in 1867, amulets of the Ise deities fell from the sky and people danced in the streets, sometimes while cross-dressing and sometimes storming into the houses of wealthy neighbors. Also like in 1867, there was a degree of order, even amid the ecstatic celebrations. Before villagers in present-day Itami began dancing, they first applied for permission from the authorities, then rehearsed their moves before finally dancing at the local shrine, after which they hit the road and challenged nearby villagers to dance competitions, even inviting dance instructors to gain the upper hand. Scholars generally agree that Okage Mairi and the dancing which accompanied the 1830 event in particular provide the most direct precedent for Eijanaika, and people at the time saw it that way as well. Though we use Eijanaika to refer to the phenomenon as a whole, actual use of that phrase during the dancing was mostly limited to Western Japan. In many regions, the celebrations were referred to as Okage pilgrimages or Okage dancing. But there were also important differences between the two phenomena. For example, the sheer variety of things that fell from the sky in 1867. While Ise amulets still made up a majority in many places due to their popularity, people seemed to grab whatever amulets, Buddhist images, or other vaguely divine objects they had lying around. And just as the amulets falling from the sky became localized, so did pilgrimage. Rather than flocking to the Ise shrines from across the country, most communities instead went on group pilgrimage to shrines and temples closer to home. Now, it turns out there was a lot of dancing going on in late Tokugawa Japan, so I'll mention just one more precedent, the Inari dancing of 1865, so called because it began at an Inari shrine in present-day Hyogo Prefecture, where villagers had gathered to help out with construction work, which often led to festivities. Soon enough, the festive mood began to spread, and people were dressing up and dancing throughout the area, with the fever reaching a peak right as the shogun's army arrived in Osaka for its punitive expedition against Choshu, who the people expressed sympathy for, singing songs about the upcoming battle as they danced. In other villages later on, however, songs about Choshu faded away and people instead saw dancing as a way to ward off the cholera epidemic that had begun to ravage the Kyoto and Osaka area. I chose this example because it illustrates three parallels with Eijanaika. First, it began with a mundane celebration, in this case the entertainment associated with community labor, but then exploded into a broader phenomenon. Second, it shows how song and dance could be a way for ordinary people to express their reactions to politics and current events. And third, it shows how the meaning people assigned to the celebrations could change from place to place. Some sang about the confrontation between Choshu and the shogunate, while others danced to ward off cholera. So how does this compare with the events of 1867? We've already seen how the dancing fever began with the celebration of a pre-planned festival in the small village of Muro, but then spiraled out of control as it spread. Now, what about the second point? The celebrations, of course, coincided with momentous events in Japanese history. By the end of the year, an anti-shogunal coalition had engineered a palace coup which stripped the last shogun of power, and the two sides were poised to do battle over the fate of the country. Was the dancing a response to this political turbulence? Actually, one of the earliest theories of Eijanaika was that it was all a conspiracy by anti-shogunal forces to sow chaos that would keep the masses occupied, paralyze the authorities, and provide cover for revolutionary activities. For example, shogunal official Fukuchi Gennichido later wrote in a memoir, "Some say that the falling amulets were a plot by those in Kyoto to cause havoc among the people. Whether or not this is true, I do not know." He himself experienced obstruction of official business when his party couldn't find a single porter to hire, as everyone in town was busy dancing. Certainly, it would be easier to scheme in the shadows while mayhem clogged the streets. The celebrations in Kyoto suspiciously began in the middle of the 10th month, right after Yoshinobu returned the powers of government to the emperor, and continued until the palace coup and declaration of imperial rule in the 12th month, though this end date probably had more to do with the authorities beginning to crack down. Court noble Iwakura Tomomi, one of the leading architects of the Meiji Restoration, later remembered the dancing as assistance from heaven. But however much anti-shogunal, or for that matter pro-shogunal forces may have taken advantage of the chaos, no historian today seriously thinks that the entire thing was a conspiracy by political actors. At the same time, there's no denying that, in some cases, the political events of the day were very much on the minds of the people as they danced. In Onomichi, amulets began falling one day after Choshu forces arrived in town. One of the soldiers recorded that people danced while singing, "Isn't it great? Choshu's going up to the capital. Isn't it great?" He took it as a sign that they were welcoming his army. In Fujisawa, a post station along the Tokaido, people staged a mock funeral procession for the shogunate, hoisting a coffin along with a banner that read Toshogu, the shrine at Nikko which served as the mausoleum of the Tokugawa shoguns. They also threw stones at a pair of foreigners who chose the wrong time to pass through town. Anti-foreigner sentiment was one of the primary ways that ordinary people engaged with politics at the time, and reports of stones falling on the houses of foreigners in the treaty port of Yokohama were widespread. In faraway Tokushima, people sang, "On the nation of Japan it's raining gods, on the houses of foreigners it's raining stones. Isn't it great? Isn't it great?" And yet, one struggles to find a clear political dimension in all or even most cases, especially in the early months when the dancing had yet to spread beyond the Tokai region. Takashi Miura, one of the few scholars to write about this subject recently, argues that historians try too hard to see the dancing as a sort of anti-shogunal demonstration, when the majority of cases were, festive energy aside, relatively orderly and respectful of authority. So, if not politics, what was the main factor driving the celebrations? Well, according to Miura, it's the economy, stupid. The years immediately preceding Eijonaika were a time of extreme hardship for people across Japan as crops failed and prices skyrocketed. These two graphs show the price of rice in Kariya, a town located between Nagoya and the post station of Yoshida, close to where the dancing began. You can see that prices climbed to insane levels beginning in the second half of 1865, peaked in the first half of 1867, then dropped dramatically, albeit to a level that was still quite high. The most direct cause of this inflation was mobilization for the shogunate's second Choshu expedition. The shogun's army left Edo in the 5th month of 1865 and marched along the Tokaido to Osaka, bringing with them an enormous demand for food and other goods that drove prices up. The situation was similar in and around Kyoto and Osaka. In Osaka, rice prices increased almost sixfold from 1864 to 1866, then dropped by half in 1867. Rampant inflation combined with poor harvest led to an unprecedented number of protests, riots, and uprisings across both rural and urban Japan. But by late 1867, things were looking up. A streak of fair weather yielded a bountiful harvest, and prices had begun to drop. Recall the observations of our eyewitness in Nagoya. Compared to the hunger and hardship of last year, this fall's harvest is plentiful, and people's hearts are at ease. Finally, the people had something to celebrate. In conclusion, then, we can describe the origins of the dancing fever as follows. Improved economic conditions set the stage. All people needed was an excuse to let loose, and that excuse was provided by centennial celebrations of the Ho festival. In anticipation of the upcoming festivities, people got the idea to plant divine amulets around town, and the discovery of these miracles triggered festival fever. But this analysis only holds true for the very first cases near Yoshida. As the dancing spread from village to village, and then along the highways from town to city, it took on a life of its own, the initial triggers no longer relevant. It required no justification other than that everybody else was doing it, and as it came to each new community, people were free to assign their own meaning to it, based on their specific context. We've seen that some celebrations showed a clear political dimension, especially as we move into Western Japan and into the later months of 1867, when events in Kyoto cast the fate of the shogunate into question. And we shouldn't dismiss that political aspect in favor of a solely economic explanation. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Ultimately, there can be no single explanation or meaning of a phenomenon that, over the course of 9 months, spanned half the country from humble farming villages to thriving urban centers, and involved everyone from children and domestic servants to wealthy merchants and even the daimyo themselves. Some danced to celebrate a good harvest and better times ahead. Others danced to the imminent fall of a government which had failed them. For some, it was a week off work to party and drink free sake. For others, a headache at all the expenses needed to fund the celebrations. And no doubt many people danced because why the hell not? They weren't all dancing to the same tune, but together they danced into a revolution. Thank you for watching this video. As usual, you can find all my sources in the full script linked in the description. I'd appreciate it if you dropped a comment to ask a question, share something interesting you learned, or just to say hi. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.